Have you ever met a stranger, not through words, not even through a glance, but through a quiet act of courage left beneath a windshield wiper? One girl's trembling apology would become the spark that stirred life in a man who thought he'd stopped feeling long ago, not through drama, not through noise, but through the purity of truth. That afternoon, the sky wore the shade of surrender, gray and soft, like a curtain drawn gently across the sun. Elira pushed her bike beside her with the kind of stillness that comes from being used to the background, the type of presence that never seeks permission, only space. She passed through Halden Park, its lot nearly empty. A black car sat near the edge, so polished it seemed misplaced, too fine for these quiet streets. She tried to slip by without touching it, but the slightest motion of her handlebar whispered against the car's paint a scratch, thin, almost invisible. But to her, it might as well have been carved into glass. She froze, no one saw. There was no sound except the hum of a far-off wind. The simplest choice would have been to leave, and yet something in her couldn't. From the folds of her worn backpack, she pulled a piece of paper, creased soft at the edges. Her fingers trembled, the pen smudged. She rewrote the note twice before the words came out right. "I'm sorry. I scratched your car. I wish I could fix it. I can't offer much, but I'll take responsibility. If you're upset, I understand. Here's my number." She placed it beneath the wiper, with care, as though setting down a fragile truth. Her brown hair shifted across her face in the wind, hiding her expression, revealing only her eyes, full of quiet apology. She didn't take a photo, didn't leave an explanation, just stood there for a single moment, looking at the car, not like an object, but like a confession. And then she wheeled her bike away. Back in the lecture hall, her body sat in a chair, but her mind hadn't left that parking lot. The numbers on the screen blurred like foreign script. She imagined a man reading her note, angry shouting, demanding reparation. She couldn't afford. Elira lived alone, above a bakery that smelled of cinnamon and regret. Her days were made of quiet routines, studying part-time, working weekends at a tea shop. Every crack in her world cost something, and her phone, it stayed silent, which somehow hurt even more than if it had rung the next morning. On her way to the bookstore, she saw it again, the black car resting in the exact same spot. She didn't look. Her chest tightened. Her legs pedaled faster. That evening, under a faint and fading moon, she returned for her bike, and he was there, a man maybe in his 40s. Tall still, his coat was long, his presence even longer. In his hands, a notebook aged and leather-bound. He wasn't looking at the scratch. He was looking at her, not accusing, not judging, just waiting. He didn't speak right away. In fact, for a moment, he didn't even look at her. But when she moved closer, just a step, his gaze finally met hers, not with accusation, not with suspicion, but with something softer. "You're the one who left the note," he said. His voice wasn't sharp. It carried the weight of someone remembering how to be gentle. Elira's chest tightened. Just 6 words, but they hit like a bell in a cathedral. I'm really sorry," she murmured. "I didn't mean to. If the damage is bad, I can find a way to pay." He lifted a hand, not to dismiss her, but to pause the spiral. "I didn't call to demand money," he said, voice quiet, like early morning. "I just wanted to meet the person who left it." She bit her lower lip, the weight of shame still clinging to her posture. Her hands clenched the straps of her backpack until her knuckles turned pale. "I don't have much," she whispered. "But I'll figure it out. I just didn't want to disappear." He gave a strange, almost surprised laugh, low, unpolished. "You really think that's why I'm here?" For the first time, she looked directly at him. The streetlight overhead carved shadows across his face, lines. Not from anger, but from memory. He didn't look like a man who'd come to collect a debt. He looked like someone who hadn't expected to feel anything at all. And suddenly, "Did most people would have walked away," he said. No one was watching, no one would have known, but you left a truth behind. That takes something rare. She didn't respond. A part of her wanted to believe him, wanted to trust the softness in his tone, but the other part, the one that had grown up learning to protect herself, stayed silent. Then he said something she didn't expect. Sometimes he murmured, "A scratch is just a beginning, disguised as damage." She didn't know what that meant. Not fully. But it didn't feel like he was talking only to her. They didn't speak again. He didn't ask for her number, didn't mention the repair, just nodded once, like an unsent letter sealed itself. And then she left. That night, as she pedaled through the still streets, her chest felt just a little lighter. Not free, but no longer weighed down by fear. His words floated beside her. Like leaves caught in a slow breeze, a scratch can be a beginning. At home, she opened her bag and found the note she hadn't used, the first version messy and misspelled, wrinkled at the edges. She smoothed it with her palm and stared at the ink smudged by sweat and nerves, and then she laughed, not loud, not sure, but real. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a while, she didn't dread it. When morning came, she woke earlier than usual, not because she needed to, but because her sleep had been stitched together with restless thoughts. His face, the note, the strange warmth in his voice. She barely knew him. They'd exchanged no more than a few sentences, but somehow his presence lingered in her mind like the hush that follows a song you didn't know you needed. She couldn't explain why, or maybe she was just afraid to. He seemed like someone far from her world, someone who wore confidence like a coat not borrowed like hers. And yet when he looked at her, it wasn't pity, it wasn't curiosity, it was something far rarer, recognition. She pulled her jacket tight around her and stepped out into the morning mist. Her breath rose like smoke. She hadn't planned on seeing him again, had even mapped out a longer route just to avoid that parking lot, but life has a habit of circling back to what it's not finished with. At the corner cafe, the one with the quiet music and warm lights strung across the awning, she saw him. Not by accident, he was waiting, seated alone at the table, furthest from the world beneath the golden bulbs that glowed like gentle eyes, in the middle of winter. He raised a hand, not as a command, not even as an invitation, just a quiet signal, like he'd seen her in a dream once and now wasn't sure if she was real. She walked slowly toward him, her heartbeat no longer panicked, just uncertain. Not from fear, but from something she didn't yet know how to name. She wasn't scared, not exactly, but there was a trembling inside her that had nothing to do with fear, just the uncertain pull of being seen by someone who didn't seem like they were supposed to notice her at all. He looked up as if he'd been expecting her, though not with certainty, more like hope, held loosely in open hands. "I had a feeling you'd take this road again," he said. His voice moved like wind through dry branches, gentle, but carrying the ache of winter. "I didn't think a note could keep me awake," he added with a quiet smile. Elira didn't know how to answer. She just looked down, gripping her bag like it could anchor her to the ground. Her fingers curled, not from fear, but from the weight of unfamiliar territory. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was something else, like the pause between verses in a song, meant to be heard only by two. Without asking, he slid a warm cup across the table toward her. Hope I got it right. She took one tentative sip, then gave the smallest of nods. "I don't like bitter, me neither." And for the first time, she let herself look at him, really look. There were lines on his face, yes, but they didn't speak of defeat. They spoke of time, of stories, of someone who had weathered storms, but never lost his softness. "I used to think honesty was something everyone carried," he said, his tone dropping into something quiet. "But I've realized it's more like an heirloom now, rare and too often forgotten." She didn't know if he was talking about her or someone from his past, but his words felt like a small, unspoken grief. I left the note because I knew I wouldn't sleep if I didn't, she admitted barely above a whisper. He was quiet for a breath, then nodded. There was a time I did the same, he said. Left a note on someone's windshield. They thought I was lying, called me names. After that, I stopped trying to explain myself to strangers. She looked at him then, and something between them bent. Time difference, background age. For a fleeting moment, they weren't who the world told them to be, just two people, each a little scraped from trying to do the right thing. Yesterday reminded me that maybe the world I used to believe in hasn't disappeared completely, he said, eyes holding something fragile but intact. Her throat tightened, not from sadness, but from the quiet surprise of being trusted without having to prove she deserved it. He extended his hand across the table, not as an introduction, but like offering the name itself was a kind of peace. I'm Jonas, Elira, she said, her voice steady this time. He repeated it, like it was a name he'd once heard in a song he forgot he loved. Foreign familiar, soothing. What did you do? Before she asked the question slipping from her, like a leaf falling without wind, I used to make films, he replied. Now I'm learning how to live again. She didn't understand it, not fully, but somehow it didn't feel like she needed to. He didn't ask her what she studied or what her life looked like, and she didn't explain. Because between them, explanation was not a requirement. I didn't come to ask for anything he said that last, just to say thank you. And if you'll let me, I'd like to buy you breakfast, not as a repayment, but for the simple fact that you reminded me sometimes the smallest things open the biggest doors. A smile, one that wasn't practiced, broke across her face. The first real one of the day, so they sat together, beneath the canopy of the cafe, in the cool light of morning, not as strangers, not yet as friends, but as two stories that had accidentally found the same sentence. Later he brought her to a place he called the world that fell asleep. It was a theater long since abandoned, hidden between red-bricked alleys, its wooden sign barely legible, its windows fogged with time. Once people had lined up outside its doors with dreams in their eyes, now it stood in silence filled only with dust, memories, and a sliver of possibility. The building looked like it had exhaled a long time ago and never remembered how to breathe. Back in faded sunlight slipped through broken panes, slicing across dust that danced in the stillness. The air held the scent of velvet, left too long in the dark, familiar aching. This place used to matter to me, Jonas said as he gently pushed the creaking door open. His voice dropped slightly, as if even sound might disturb the ghosts that lived inside. I did everything here once. Cleaned the seats, fixed the lights, hung the posters, but whenever a film played, he paused, a softness blooming behind his eyes. I stood in the corner and pretended it was mine. Elira stepped in, slowly, wincing as the hinges groaned behind her. The silence inside was not hollow. It was full of something unspoken. She didn't know why he had brought her here, but her heart did. He stood near the faded screen, its surface cracked like an old promise. My first film premiere. Here, he said. It was supposed to be a beginning, but the critics tore it apart. The investors left. I lost more than money that day. I lost belief. He moved down the aisle, settling into a seat halfway back, the kind of seat where the sound hits just right, he murmured. She sat beside him, not close enough to touch, but near enough to hear the quiet between his sentences. Do you know what hurt the most? He asked, turning to her, his gaze heavy, not with pain, but with the weight of remembering. It wasn't the failure. It was what came after. Nothing. No advice. No insult. Just silence, like I stopped existing. Elira didn't try to fix it. She didn't rush to respond because she understood. Silence isn't always peace. Sometimes it's absence. And absence, when it comes from the ones who once believed in you, hurts the most. I had other offers. He continued. His tone was flat now. Distant, but I turned them down. I was too scared, not of failing again, but of having nothing left if I did. She looked at him, and for the first time saw not a man who had lost his way, but one who had paused out of exhaustion, not defeat. In him, she saw her own quiet fears, the ways we step back from the things we love, not because we've stopped loving them, but because we're afraid we're not enough to hold them. I made money, he said, real estate stocks. Whatever people said was wise. They started calling me a success, a millionaire. He gave a dry smile, but every time I saw a blank screen, something inside me stayed hollow. She inhaled deeply and then quietly asked, "Do you still have the script?" Jonas didn't speak at first, just stared at the screen as if remembering where he'd once stood, what he once believed. Then came the faintest smile. Half regret, half wonder. "I do," he said. "I haven't opened it in years. I'd like to read it," she said gently, "if you'd let me." He turned to her, not surprised but changed as though her words had tapped on a door he thought had been locked forever. "I came to thank you," he said softly. "I didn't expect you'd make me want to start again." "I don't know anything about film," Elira replied with a small, almost embarrassed laugh, "but I do know what it feels like to be scared. And I think if you wrote something honest, it deserves at least one person to read it." He looked at her, and in her eyes, he didn't see admiration or judgment. He saw something rarer, someone who saw him not for his past, or his money, or his failure, but simply for the fact that he still mattered. "All right," he said, "but you have to promise me one thing." "What's that?" "Be honest, even if it's terrible, even if you hate every word. Tell me the truth." She nodded, without hesitation. "Sab'an disrotim." He stood walking toward the back of the theater with a slowness that came not from age, but reverence. Moments later, he returned, hands holding a stack of aged pages bound with brittle tape and a crumpled cardboard cover. In one corner, the words had almost faded completely. Scene 57 rewrite. Pending. "I never wrote the ending," he said quietly. I wasn't ready to face it." Elira took the script in both hands. It wasn't heavy in weight, but in meaning, it was immense. Each page carried years of silence, abandoned hope, and a question left unanswered. She said nothing, only held it close like someone receiving not a manuscript, but a heart entrusted, waiting to be heard. Elira held the script, not like a bundle of paper, but like something living, fragile, quiet, and unfinished. She didn't read it immediately. She simply let it rest against her chest for a moment, as though making a promise. No one else would ever hear that night she couldn't sleep. The manuscript sat on her desk beside a half-full cup of tea, gone cold, and the soft amber light of her old lamp. Its pages smelled faintly of dust and time, like the breath of a memory caught between the shelves of a forgotten library. She wasn't trained to read scripts. She didn't know anything about acts or structures or the mechanics of story, but she read anyway, slowly. Not with her eyes alone, but with the parts of herself she rarely let speak her uncertainty, her hesitations, her quiet wish to be heard without ever asking for it. It was a story about a man who once told stories for a living until grief stole his voice. He wandered through old cinemas like someone searching for what he had lost. Not just scenes, but the courage to finish them. Characters lingered in half-written conversations. Endings remained unwritten. And then, near the end, a girl appeared, not to rescue him, not to change him, just to sit beside the silence and listen. When Elira reached the final page, her breath caught. Scene 57 was blank, only a faint scribble in the corner, rewrite pending. But maybe silence is enough. She read that line again. Then again, not because she didn't understand it, but because she did too well. It felt like it had been written about her, or maybe for her, as if somewhere Inside his words, her own unspoken ones had finally found a place to land. She didn't write a review. She didn't edit a thing. She tore a small piece of paper from her notebook and with a hand that trembled just slightly, wrote something. Just one thought. Not loud, not clever. No title, no signature. Just truth, whispered in ink. The next morning, she walked the familiar path back to the theater. In the cafe next door, Jonas sat at a corner table with an untouched espresso and the kind of stillness people carry when they're waiting for something they're afraid might not come. "I thought you'd need more time," he said when he saw her. "So did I," she replied, her voice gentler than she expected. She handed him the script, tucked between the last few pages, folded once, and quiet as breath was the slip of paper. He opened it carefully. His hands shook, not from nerves, but from the weight of what he hadn't dared hold in a long time. He read the note slowly. "If silence is what you've chosen, then I hope someone listens deeply enough to realize it's not empty." He stared at that line. The cafe faded around him. The sounds, the people, the ticking clock on the wall. Everything fell still. "I wrote that," she said, voice almost a whisper, because sometimes, when we end something in silence, the world assumes we've given up. But maybe we're just afraid no one will understand what's still left unsaid. He didn't look up right away. His eyes remained on the page, like he was seeing not the ink, but the space behind it, the meaning between the words. And when he did look at her, something in him had shifted. It wasn't just gratitude. It was reverence, like a piece of him had been returned by a stranger who somehow knew where it had been all along. "You have no idea," he said quietly, "what you just did. Not for this story, but for me." Elira lowered her gaze. She didn't need to respond because something inside her already knew this wasn't about understanding. It was about being heard, finally fully, even if only once. They left the cafe together without saying much more, not because there was nothing to say, but because for the first time, the silence between them wasn't empty, it was full of something beginning. There was a rhythm, now, quiet and subtle, not the kind you march to, more like a shared breath, between two people who had both grown used to quiet lives. Elira and Jonas didn't become collaborators overnight. They weren't teacher and student either. They were simply two people who had once lived on the edges of their own voices and now gently were learning how to speak again. They claimed a forgotten corner in the old theater, nothing more than a crooked table and two uneven chairs beneath a window, dusted by time. It wasn't an office. It wasn't meant to be. But in that silence, cracked and golden with morning light, there was just enough space to hear themselves think. At first, they didn't write. They sat takeaway cups, warming their hands, and spoke of movies that left them breathless, pages in books that broke them for reasons they couldn't name, or the way the theater's wooden walls smelled like rain soaked into memory. Some days they spent hours talking about a single moment in the script. Scene 2, should the man meet her eyes? Speak. Or should he look away? Should he speak or let the silence carry the weight? For the first time in years, Jonas picked up a pen. His hand moved slowly as if the ink had to wade through years of hesitation. Before becoming words, Elira wrote in blue ink. Her handwriting, small and slanted. Sometimes it was a line of dialogue. Sometimes it was just a single question mark. She didn't try to sound clever. She simply wanted to understand. And there was no hierarchy between them. Jonas never talked down, Elira never deferred. They met each other not as expert and beginner, but as two voices, uneven in volume, but equal in value. One afternoon, sunlight caught the curve of Elira's empty teacup. She turned to him and said softly, "Every time I write it, feels like I'm answering a question. I've never been brave enough to ask aloud, Jonas smiled, the kind that comes after silence, not instead of it. I write like I'm trying to find an old house I thought was torn down, and so the story changed. It was no longer just about a man who had once loved stories. It became about two people, one who had lost his voice and one who never thought hers deserved to be heard. Together, they wrote a story. Neither of them could have written alone. Then one morning, just as they were revisiting the newest version of Scene 57, the old theater door creaked open. A man entered, older, silver-haired, carrying the weight of years in the business, but without the cynicism. His name was Marcus, a film producer who used to work with Jonas and who still, every weekend, visited this forgotten place like lighting a candle in a chapel no one else prayed in anymore. I heard someone was breathing life back into this place, Marcus said, eyes landing on the script in Jonas's hands. Jonas paused, not out of shame, but out of honesty. I'm writing again, he said, then glanced at Elira. Not alone to this time. Marcus sat. He read a few pages slowly, carefully. He didn't speak right away. His face stayed unreadable, but there was a narrowing of his brow, not out of doubt, but out of focus. He pointed to a line of dialogue, halfway through. She wrote this. Jonas nodded. She helped me realize the story needed a different voice. Marcus didn't smile. Not yet. He just nodded slowly. Then stood, reached into his coat, and placed a business card on the table. If you're serious about this, both of you call me, he said. Maybe it won't become a film, but it deserves to be heard. After Marcus left, the air in the room felt different. Not lighter, not heavier, just fuller. Jonas turned to her, and something in his expression glowed with a hesitant warmth, like sunlight breaking through a thick old cloud. You just made me remember something, he said. What's that, she asked. He looked at the pages between them, then back at her. That stories don't need to be loud to matter, and sometimes the smallest voice is the one that opens the biggest door. Jonas had once believed that only those with grand ideas, polished pitches, and voices loud enough to echo through industry halls could make films. But sitting across from Elira now, watching her eyes quietly hold her ground, he realized something else. Stories don't belong only to the bold. They belong to the ones who dare to believe their voice is worth hearing. Even if it trembles, Elira didn't reply to his words. She didn't have to, but inside her, something opened, small, green, and new, the kind of hope that only grows after a long, silent winter. They didn't call Marcus the next day, or the day after that. No meetings, no strategy, just words, a little more, each morning, not for success, not even for completion, but because for the first time, what they were writing didn't feel like reaching and it felt like remembering. But then came the meeting, a room with hard white lights that made the air feel too clean, too cold, as if there was no space left for emotion, only budgets, only forecasts, only that same tired question. But will it sell? Jonas sat at the head of the table. Across from him, Marcus, and beside Marcus, two men who smelled of polished wood and passive judgment. One young hair, slicked to perfection, scrolling through a tablet, like it could tell him everything worth knowing. The other, older, slow, with his words sipping a coffee he never really drank. Elira sat beside Jonas. Her palms were damp, her shoulders stiff. She had rehearsed story arcs, emotional beats, why they didn't need a kiss to mean connection. But nothing prepares you for eyes that strip your story down to its numbers. The younger one didn't wait long. The ending's unclear, said. Audiences want resolution, a hug, a kiss, something that tells them what happens next. Jonas opened his mouth, but Elira beat him to it. Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't waver. It's not a story about what happens next, she said. All eyes turned. It's a story about what happens within, about someone who stopped trying and chose to begin again, about a girl who thought her voice didn't matter until she used it anyway. The older investor frowned. So, a monologue, instead of a climax. Elira met his gaze, calm but unyielding. Not all clarity is powerful. Sometimes the most honest stories are the ones that let you feel the answer instead of showing it. Jonas turned to her, not to help, but to listen. Because this moment didn't belong to him. She wasn't protecting his story. She was standing for theirs. She continued gently. This isn't a story of spectacle. It's about small things, a scratch on a car, a trembling note, a script left unfinished, moments that seem forgettable until they quietly change a life. The room grew still. Marcus leaned back, and for the first time that morning, a smile broke the stillness of his face, not big, not performative, just a flicker. Like remembering why he ever loved this business to begin with. We don't only invest in what's guaranteed, he said. We invest in what might move someone. The younger man nodded, albeit reluctantly. The older one said nothing, but he didn't say no. Outside, the wind had picked up. The city was shifting toward winter, bare trees, a colder kind of silence. On the walk home, Jonas was quiet for a long while. Then, as they passed a line of flickering street lamps, he spoke. I used to think this story was something I needed to protect, he said, not looking at her. But today, I realized it doesn't belong to me alone anymore. Elira said nothing. She didn't need to. What she knew, what settled deep inside her chest, like breath, was that the story didn't ask to be owned. It only ever asked to be believed in. In her chest, something had settled. Not pride, not even relief, but a quiet knowing. Her voice had not trembled. Not because she had learned to be brave, but because she finally understood what it meant to speak for something that needed to be heard. If she didn't speak for this story, no one would, and for the first time, that truth didn't frighten her. I'm proud of you, Jonas, said barely above the wind. She didn't respond right away, just looked forward as the street lamps began to glow their golden halos, flickering against the bare trees. There was no applause, no soundtrack swelling in her mind, only stillness. The kind of stillness that comes after you've walked through fear and discovered it was not as big as your silence had made it. She was no longer the girl who left an apology, trembling beneath a windshield wiper. She was the girl who rewrote the ending, not just of the story, but of herself. That afternoon slipped gently into dusk. The light faded slowly, as if the world itself knew something sacred was about to unfold and had no need to announce it. The sun dipped behind the rooftops of that old part of town, casting a golden hue along the narrow street where the theater still stood, not polished, not modern, but waiting like it always had, with quiet patience. There were no red carpets, no cameras, no gowns or flashbulbs. Just a small wooden sign outside, chalk drawn in uneven script. Tonight. One story, two hearts. Countless silences. Elira stood at the entrance, wrapped in a simple, pale blue dress, her hair pinned back. Her arms cradled the same notebook, where months ago she'd scribbled the first tentative notes to scene 57. Her heart beat fast, not from fear of rejection, but from the raw tremor of finally being seen. Inside, Jonas stood beneath the amber light, adjusting the projector one last time. He no longer looked like the man who once hid behind past versions of himself. There was light in his eyes, now subtle but unmistakable, like someone who had reclaimed a part of himself that he thought time had erased. No more than 30 people came, old friends, a few of Elira's classmates, the woman from the cafe where they first sat together. The retired guard from the theater, still carrying the key like it was a piece of history. Each of them came not for spectacle, but for something honest. The lights dimmed, the screen lit up, and Elira held her breath. The film was quiet under an hour. No special effects, no grand reveals, scenes just still frames, sparse dialogue, and long lingering silences where people simply looked at one another or looked away. But in those silences, something stirred. In the scene where a man stood before a blank screen, alone in an empty theater, Elira saw the exact frame Jonas had described that day he spoke of his failure. And in the moment the girl left a note under a windshield, the camera didn't move. It simply held, long enough for the audience to hear the breeze, the breath, the heartbeat of a kindness no one had witnessed until now. And then came the ending. Not words exactly, but a woman's voice, soft almost like smoke, curling upward. Not everyone has the courage to speak, but if someone is listening, then even silence becomes a language. The screen faded to black. There was no applause, just a long breath from somewhere near the back, a quiet sniffle, and a whisper. That was me once. Elira looked at Jonas. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. Every frame had already spoken. Afterward, they moved into the courtyard. A table set with tea, a plate of cookies still warm, strings of soft lights, overhead swaying gently. Like wind chimes, made of glow, someone clinked their glass to Elira's. A man who had known Jonas long before this chapter began. That story, he said, was honest. Thank you for not giving it the ending people expect. A woman approached Elira quietly, her hands weathered but gentle. I was silent for years, she said, voice carrying the kind of weight only truth can hold. Watching your story, I saw a piece of myself I thought was gone. Elira didn't know how to answer, so she didn't. She simply smiled lightly, like wind brushing through tall grass, because some gratitude is too personal to echo aloud. Eventually, the courtyard emptied, teacups gathered, lights dimmed, only they remained. Jonas sat on the stone steps just outside the theater, his shoes dusted with the hush of evening. Elira joined him, shoulders barely touching. But it was enough. I was thinking, she murmured, eyes following a slow star above the roofline. If someone asked me whether this was the ending or the beginning, what would I say? Jonas smiled without turning. I'd say, it doesn't matter, as long as we keep writing. So they sat there in that space, between stars and streetlight, not needing their story to close. Because what truly needed to be said had already been told. The first rain of the season came without warning. Soft drops tapped against the glass, like a quiet reminder. Things move forward, even when we're still. Elira sat at her desk, small wooden familiar, beside her a cactus in a chipped pot, a mug of tea, gone cool, and the final version of the script, its old title erased. Now it read only. Scene 57, she had rewritten the ending. Not because anyone told her to, not for critics, not for investors, but because something inside her, long buried, had risen gently, asking to be spoken. This version had no confessions, no orchestras, no declarations beneath the rain. Just a girl in a cafe, opening a notebook and quietly writing, not to be read, not to be shared, just to hold on to the story that had once silenced her and finally let it speak. Jonas read it alone in the quiet theater, no audience, no lights, just the projector flickering faintly in the background and the weight of the pages resting in his lap. He read every word slowly, like breathing it in. And when he reached the last line, he didn't move, not because he didn't understand, but because he did. We don't get to choose when the story starts, but we can always rewrite the ending. It was just one sentence, but to him, it felt like a door cracking open, a gesture of forgiveness, a welcome home, a beginning wearing the quiet clothes of closure. The next week, Elira visited her childhood home in the quiet outer edges of the city. She brought the script with her, not to show off, not to prove anything, but to slip it quietly onto the bookshelf in her old room between worn novels and school journals, a quiet place for something that had once felt impossible. Her mother noticed, "You used to write on the back of bread wrappers," she said, touching the stack gently, "and now you've written an entire film." Elira brushed her hand along the spine. "I just rewrote the things I used to be afraid of. On another afternoon, Jonas invited her for a walk. They returned to the park where it had all begun. The trees were bare now, their branches drawn like fine charcoal lines across the sky. The bench, that bench, stood still in its place. New paint. Same memory. I used to think endings were always sad, Jonas said as they slowed beside it. But maybe I just never waited long enough to see them through. Elira smiled gently, her hands tucked into her coat sleeves. An ending isn't where a story dies, she replied. It's where it no longer needs to be explained. They didn't hold hands, they didn't have to. There was no dramatic music, no grand embrace beneath falling snow. But in the quiet glance they shared, as their footsteps matched across the path, there was peace. The kind that comes not from finding answers, but from finally letting the questions rest. Winter crept in. Without ceremony, a hush settled over the trees. And one morning, Elira sat by the window wrapped in a knitted scarf, pen in hand. Not writing a script this time, but a letter. Dear you, the one who once feared you weren't enough. I used to believe that a scratch meant something was broken, but now I know it's just the place where light finds its way in. Thank you for pausing, for reading the note I left behind, because if you hadn't, this story might never have begun. If this were a film, the frame would fade gently to a girl in a quiet room, morning light, spilling across the wooden floor, her hand resting on a blank page. No music, just the soft scratch of pen against paper, like the exhale of someone who has finally made peace with her own voice. Because the story was never really over. It had only just found a new way to be written. And if you listening now have ever wondered whether the small things you do matter, whether the quiet gesture, the soft word, the unspoken kindness was ever seen, let this be your answer. Sometimes a single note, a whispered truth, a scratch on a car can change everything. Not because it's loud, but because it's honest. If this story found you at the right time, leave a like, a comment, or simply send it to someone who might need a soft reminder that even silence, when heard, can become a language of hope. And if you want to walk through stories like this again, subscribe, because maybe in the next one, you'll see a piece of yourself looking back. To everyone who listened, felt, and stayed until the very last frame, thank you. Thank you for giving this story your time, your presence, and perhaps even a quiet piece of your heart. Stories like this are not told for applause, they are told for connection, for the soft spaces in all of us that long to be seen, heard, and understood. If this journey touched you in any way, know that your presence here means more than words can hold. You made space for honesty. You listened to silence. And in doing so, you became part of something gentle but real. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you for walking with us. We'll be here with the next story waiting for you.